They didn't hear me come in. The door was unlocked, the way it always used to be on Sunday mornings, so I let myself in the way I always used to. That was my first mistake, I suppose, assuming that always still meant something. My son was in the kitchen with his wife. I could hear them from the entryway, voices low but not low enough. I had driven 45 minutes with a pot of beef stew in a bag on the passenger seat, wrapped in a dish towel so it wouldn't tip. The pot was still warm against my hand when I stopped walking. "She just shows up," my daughter-in-law was saying. "Every single Sunday. Like we don't have our own lives." There was a pause. Then my son said, "I know. I'll talk to her." "When?" "You've been saying that for months." "I'll handle it, Renee." I stood there in the entryway for what felt like a very long time. The coat rack to my left still had the little hook I had installed myself 12 years ago when my son and Renee first moved into this house. I had come over with a drill and a level and my husband, Gerald's old toolbox, 3 months after Gerald passed, because staying busy was the only way I knew how to keep breathing. My son had been grateful then. He had hugged me in this exact entryway and said, "Mom, what would we do without you?" I set the pot of stew on the little table by the door. I walked back out. I pulled the door shut quietly behind me so they wouldn't know I had been there. I sat in my car for a few minutes before I started the engine. The November sky was the color of old pewter. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the block. I watched a woman push a stroller past the end of the driveway, and she didn't look up. And I thought, this is what invisible feels like. Not dramatic, not loud, just no one looks up. I drove home. My name is Dorothy, and I am 67 years old, and I want to tell you what happened after that Sunday morning. Not because I want your sympathy, I am long past needing that, but because I think a lot of you already know this feeling, and maybe no one has ever said out loud what I am about to say. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 4 children. My mother worked the early shift at a textile factory, and my father drove a delivery truck, and between the two of them, they managed to give us a good, plain life. Nothing fancy. Plenty of love. I understood early that love was something you showed through action, through showing up, through staying, through doing the thing that needed doing without being asked. I raised my son Marcus the same way. I showed up. I stayed. I did the things that needed doing. Gerald and I had Marcus when I was 26. He was our only child, not by choice, but by circumstance. The kind of circumstance you grieve quietly and then fold away and don't speak of again. We poured everything into that boy. Gerald coached his Little League team for 6 years. I sewed his Halloween costumes by hand until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. We went without vacations so he could go to a decent college. We went without a lot of things. Gerald died of a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 11 years ago. Marcus was 30 at the time. He came home for the funeral, stayed 4 days, and then flew back to Denver where he and Renee were living then. I understood. People have jobs. People have lives. I told him I was fine. A year later, Marcus and Renee moved back to Ohio. Renee had gotten a position at a hospital in Columbus, 45 minutes from where I lived in Marysville. I thought, and I am not ashamed of this, I thought, things will be easier now. Not just for me, for all of us. And for a while, they were. I babysat their daughter Lily every Tuesday and Thursday so Renee could pick up extra shifts. I drove Marcus to the airport at 5 in the morning, twice a month, when he had early flights for work. I made Sunday dinners and brought them over because their kitchen was always chaotic and I liked to cook, and it seemed like a simple good thing to do. I helped them with the down payment on the house, $40,000, from the account Gerald and I had saved together over 30 years. Marcus said he'd pay it back. I told him not to worry about it. I am not telling you these things, so you will think I am a saint. I am telling you because context matters. I am telling you because there is a version of this story where I am the foolish old woman who gave too much and expected too much in return. And maybe that version is partly true. But I also know that what I gave from love, and love should not make you invisible. The Sunday morning started because of Lily. She was 4 years old and she had decided that her grandmother's beef stew was the best thing she had ever eaten in her life. And every week, she would ask for it. And every week, I would make it and bring it over, and we would all eat together at the big table in Marcus and Renee's dining room. Those were good mornings. Lily would sit next to me and tell me elaborate stories about her stuffed animals, and I would listen like she was reporting on international news. Then Lily started school. Then Lily started soccer. Then Sunday mornings became complicated, and I should have noticed sooner that I was the only one who hadn't gotten the memo about the complications. There were Sundays when I arrived, and they were on their way out the door. Sundays when the stew sat in the refrigerator untouched until I quietly retrieved the pot the following week. Sundays when Renee answered the door with her phone in her hand, and that particular look on her face, not unkind, exactly, just elsewhere. Somewhere, I was not. I told myself it was a busy season. Then, I told myself it was a difficult year. I am good at telling myself things. The Sunday I stood in the entryway and heard my son say he would handle me was in November. I drove home and I put the kettle on, and I sat at my kitchen table and I let myself think clearly for the first time in a long while. I thought about the $40,000. I thought about 6 years of Tuesday and Thursday babysitting. Every week, never once saying I was tired or had other plans. Even the Thursday I had a fever of 101 and drove over anyway because Renee had a double shift. I thought about the airport runs in the dark. I thought about the toolbox and the coat hook and the dish towel wrapped around a pot of stew. I thought about Lily, who still called me every few days and told me about her stuffed animals, who was 7 now and had recently informed me, very seriously, that I was her best friend. And then I thought about what I was going to do. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not go home that Sunday and immediately become a strong, clear-eyed woman who knew exactly what to do. I cried. I cried for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table with my tea going cold. I cried the way you cry when you realize that the thing you feared might be true has been true for longer than you let yourself know. I called my friend Patricia, who has been my closest friend since we were both young mothers in the same neighborhood in 1989. Patricia answered on the second ring, the way she always does, and I told her what I had heard, and there was silence on the line. And then Patricia said, very quietly, "Dorothy, what do you need?" I said, "I think I need a lawyer." Patricia said, "All right. I know one." Gerald and I had written our wills together, years ago. It was a straightforward document. Everything was to go to Marcus. The house, the savings, the investments Gerald had made, carefully over 40 years. It had never occurred to me to write it any other way. I called Patricia's lawyer, a woman named Helen, on Monday morning. I explained my situation. Helen asked me a number of precise, practical questions, and I answered them, and at the end of the call she said, "You can come in Thursday, if that works." I said Thursday worked. I am not going to tell you that the decision was easy. It was not. There is something deeply unnatural about sitting across from a lawyer and removing your child's name from a document. I sat in Helen's office and I thought about Marcus at 4 years old, asking me to check under his bed for monsters. I thought about Marcus at 17, sitting in the car in the driveway after a hard game, not wanting to go inside yet. I thought about the way he used to call me every Sunday when he and Renee were still in Denver, just to talk. Where does that person go? I don't know. I think that person is still in there, somewhere. But a person can love someone and also protect themselves from that person. I had learned that from Gerald's death, actually that love and grief and self-preservation can all live in the same chest at the same time. I signed the new documents. Helen walked me through every page. I left the house to Lily, in a trust. I left the savings, what remained of them, divided equally between Lily's trust and a local organization that ran support programs for older women living alone. Helen shook my hand at the door and said, "Take care of yourself, Dorothy." I said, "That's exactly what I'm doing." I drove home, and I made dinner for one, and I ate it at my kitchen table, and I watched the light change outside the window, the way it does in November, fast and gray and final. I felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt calm. I want to tell you about what happened over the next few months, because I think it matters. I stopped going to Marcus and Renee's house on Sundays. I told myself I was giving everyone a little space. Truthfully, I also needed the time. I had spent so many Sunday mornings in their kitchen that I had half forgotten what I used to do with my own time. I started walking. I had walked when Gerald was alive. We both had. Every morning, 2 miles through the neighborhood, and then, after he died, I stopped. The way you stop a lot of things. I started again in December, early in the morning when the streets were quiet and cold and I could hear my own breath. It turned out that I had missed it. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. This was Patricia's suggestion, and I resisted it for 2 weeks, and then gave in. And I want to be clear, I am not talented. My first 3 paintings were genuinely difficult to look at, but there was something about standing in front of a piece of paper with a brush in my hand that felt like being very quietly awake. Marcus called me once in December. He said, "Mom, we haven't seen you. Are you okay?" I said, "I'm doing well, actually. I've been keeping busy." He said, "We should do Sunday dinner soon." I said, "That would be nice. Let me know when works for you." He said he would. He did not call back for 3 weeks. Renee called me in January. This surprised me. Renee and I had always been polite to each other, warm enough on the surface, careful underneath, the way you are with a person you have decided to manage rather than know. She asked how I was and I told her, and there was a pause. And then she said, "Dorothy, I want to apologize. For some things." I said, "All right, I've been short with you. For a long time. It wasn't fair. I didn't say anything." I had learned late in life, maybe too late, that silence is not the same as agreement, and sometimes it is more useful. Renee said, "Lily asks about you every day. She cries on Thursdays because you're not there." Something moved in my chest when she said that, but I kept it where it was. I said, "I love Lily very much. She knows that. She wants to come see you. Could she?" "Just for a day?" I said yes. Of course I said yes. Lily came over on a Saturday in late January. She came in the front door, and she looked around my house the way she always did, cataloging it, making sure everything was where she had left it, and then she looked at me with those serious 7-year-old eyes and she said, "Grandma, I missed you so much." I said, "I missed you too, baby." She stayed for 8 hours. We made her grandmother's beef stew together. She stood on her step stool and stirred, and we watched 2 movies. And she told me about the new stuffed animal she had gotten for Christmas, a walrus she had named Professor Buttons, and I listened to every word. Before Marcus came to pick her up that evening, Lily took my hand and said, very seriously, "Grandma, are you lonely?" I thought about that. I thought about the walks and the watercolor class and my kitchen table and the light in November. I said, "No, sweetheart, I'm not lonely." She studied my face the way children do, checking for lies, and then she nodded, satisfied. When Marcus came to the door, he looked at me differently than I expected. He looked at me the way you look at something you hadn't quite been seeing. He said, "Mom, you look really good." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Could I come in for a minute?" I said yes. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had cried in November, and Marcus held his cup with both hands and said, "I think I've been taking you for granted." I said, "I know you have." He looked up. He hadn't expected that, the directness. "Good." I was done being soft about things that were true. I said, I have loved you your entire life without conditions. But I have also been showing up every week with a pot of stew and pretending not to notice when nobody wanted me there. I heard what you said, Marcus. In the entryway, his face changed. He said, Mom. I said, I'm not angry. I want you to understand that. I'm not angry, and I'm not asking for an apology. I paused. I just need you to see me clearly, not as a resource, not as a problem to handle, as a person. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Outside, I could hear Lily in the backyard, talking to herself the way she does, spinning some private story that satisfied only her. The kettle was still warm on the stove. A car passed slowly on the street. Finally, Marcus said, I'm sorry, Mom. I looked at him. I looked at my son, this person I had loved before he even had a name, and I thought about how strange it is that love can survive so many forms of damage and still be love. I said, I know you are. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. That is not how things work, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a tidy ending that real life doesn't offer. Marcus and I have had harder conversations since then. There was an evening last spring when he asked about the will, and I told him, plainly and without apology, what I had done and why. We have worked through it, slowly, the way you work through anything that matters. But here is what I want you to understand. What changed that winter was not my son. What changed was me. I stopped arranging my life around being wanted by people who weren't looking for me. I stopped making myself smaller so no one would have to acknowledge taking up space I had already earned. I started walking every morning. I kept painting, badly and happily. I planted a garden in the spring dahlias and lavender, and I tended it without hurrying, in the good, unhurried way of a person who has finally decided that her own Tuesday afternoon is worth something. Lily comes over on Saturdays now. That is her choice, not anyone's arrangement. She calls it our day, and she treats it with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who has decided something is important. Last month, she asked me to teach her how to paint, and I sat with her at the kitchen table with 2 sets of brushes and 2 cups of water, and I let her be as bad at it as she wanted. She painted a portrait of Professor Buttons that looked, generously, like an oval with ambitions. She held it up and said, Do you love it? I said, I absolutely love it. She beamed. She put it on the refrigerator herself, with 2 magnets right at the center. I am 67 years old, and I live alone in a house in Marysville, Ohio. I walk 2 miles every morning. I am a mediocre watercolor painter. My garden has dahlias and lavender, and 1 very stubborn rosebush that I have been fighting with since May. I have a granddaughter who considers me her best friend, and treats that distinction with the total commitment that children bring to the things they love. I want to say one more thing, and then I am done. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being unseen by the people who are supposed to see you. I lived inside that loneliness for years without naming it, because naming it felt like an accusation, and I was always more comfortable being gentle than being true. What I know now is this. You can love someone completely and still refuse to disappear for them. You can keep the door open and still stop walking through it uninvited. You can forgive and still protect yourself. You can be a mother and a grandmother. And also, on a cold morning in February with good shoes and no particular destination, just a woman who is walking and breathing and choosing herself over and over again, as if she finally believes she is worth choosing. I turned 68 in March. Patricia took me out for dinner at a restaurant with white tablecloths and a ridiculously complicated menu, and we stayed for 4 hours. And on the way home, I rolled down the car window, even though it was cold, and I let the air come in, and I thought, this is the thing I was looking for all along. It was not revenge. It was not even justice, exactly. It was just my own life, finally, quietly, without apology mine.